Picture three guys sealed inside a metal cone about the size of a small car, coasting toward the moon. In a few seconds, they're going to slip behind it, and the moment they do, every radio signal to Earth cuts out. No contact, no help. Back there in the dark, an engine has to fire for exactly the right number of seconds. Burn too long, they smash into the moon. Too short, and they get slingshotted off into deep space, gone for good. And nobody back on Earth will know which one happened until they come around the far side. If they come around the far side. That was December 1968. Now here's the wild part. 57 years later, in April 2026, 4 more people did the same nerve-wracking thing. Same moon, same radio blackout, same held breath back home. And one of the 3 men from that 1968 flight left the new crew a message they'd get to hear while they were out there. So this is the story of the exact same trip taken 57 years apart. And you'd figure that after half a century, with onboard computers NASA says are tens of thousands of times more powerful, the 2026 mission would crush the 1968 one in every category. In a lot of ways, it did. But in one specific way, those 3 men in 1968 pulled off something bolder than the 2026 crew even attempted. And the strange part is, the newer mission could have done the exact same thing. It just chose not to. Let's start with the rockets. Because both missions ran on the same slightly insane idea, put people on top of a giant machine that had barely flown, Apollo 8 launched on December 21st, 1968, on a Saturn V. And here's the thing that should make your stomach drop a little. That was only the 3rd Saturn V ever built, and the first one with humans strapped inside. The 2 before it had flown empty, on autopilot. So NASA basically said, the rockets work twice, more or less. Let's send 3 guys to the moon on it. Those 3 guys were Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. 57 years later, Artemis II did almost the exact same thing. It launched on April 1st, 2026, and it was the first time humans ever rode the Space Launch System, NASA's new mega rocket, inside a capsule called Orion. 4 astronauts this time: Reed Wiseman, Victor Glover, Christina Cook, and Jeremy Hansen. Both crews left from the same patch of Florida, Kennedy Space Center, from launch pads sitting right next to each other. And both had the same simple, ridiculous goal: leave the Earth, go all the way out to the moon, come home alive. That's it. That's the trip. But here's what gets me. Between those 2 launches, there's this giant 57-year gap where, for almost all of it, no human went anywhere near the moon. 12 people walked on the moon between 1969 and 1972. And then, we just stopped. The last Apollo mission, Apollo 17, came home in December 1972. And after that, humans didn't leave low Earth orbit for over 50 years. Now, we didn't forget how to do it. The priorities and the money just shifted. Once the race to reach the moon first was over, those enormous Apollo budgets dried up, and human spaceflight moved closer to home. The space shuttle, then the International Space Station, all of it orbiting just a few hundred miles up. Amazing science, incredible engineering, but nobody was heading back out to the moon. There was even a program in the 2000s that was supposed to take us back, and it got canceled. Although, plot twist, its capsule survived and became the Orion that eventually flew Artemis II. So by 2026, going to the moon was something humans had done, past tense, but not something anyone alive had done in a very long time. Which makes what happened in 1968 look even crazier the closer you look at it. Because Apollo 8 wasn't just risky, it almost didn't happen at all. Here's the situation NASA was in. The plan for Apollo 8 was originally pretty tame. It was supposed to be a test flight in orbit around the Earth, checking out the lunar module, the little spider-legged lander. But the lunar module wasn't ready. It had fallen behind schedule and over budget, and it just wasn't going to be ready in time. So NASA made a wild call. Roughly 16 weeks before launch, they decided, forget the Earth orbit test. If the lander isn't ready, we'll fly without it, and instead of circling our own planet, we'll send the crew all the way to the moon and put them in orbit around it. 16 weeks to completely rewrite a mission from loop around our own planet into go orbit another world for the first time in human history. Try planning a wedding in 16 weeks, and then imagine the stakes are 3 lives and the entire space program. Part of the reason for the rush was what was happening on the other side of the Cold War. The Soviet Union had its own moon program, and in September 1968, an uncrewed Soviet craft called Zond 5 looped around the moon and made it back to Earth. It even had a couple of tortoises on board, and they survived the trip. The message that sent was pretty clear. The Soviets might be getting ready to send actual people around the moon too. Nobody wanted to be second, so the pressure to just go was enormous. And I want to be honest about how dangerous this really was, because it's easy to forget now. The Saturn V had flown exactly twice, both times without a crew, and the second flight, Apollo 6, had gone kind of badly. The rocket shook so violently during launch that it could have torn itself apart, and 2 of its engines shut down early. That was the vehicle they were about to trust with 3 human beings. The people running the mission knew the odds weren't great. When Frank Borman's wife, Susan, asked Flight Director Chris Kraft for a straight answer on her husband's chances of coming home, his response was, "How's 50-50?" Bill Anders himself later said he figured they had about a 1 in 3 chance of not making it back at all. Susan Borman reportedly started quietly planning for a funeral. That's the mindset going in. Now let's actually take the trip. To get to the moon, you don't just point and go. First, you get into orbit around the Earth, and then, at exactly the right moment, you fire your engine again to fling yourself out of that orbit and onto a path toward the moon. For Apollo 8, that push came from the Saturn V's 3rd stage. And once it fired, those 3 men became the first humans in history to leave Earth's gravity behind and head for another world. They flew what's called a free return trajectory. It's a clever and honestly kind of comforting piece of orbital mechanics. You aim so that if your engine dies completely, the moon's gravity naturally slingshots you back toward Earth anyway. It's the, if everything breaks, we still probably come home setting. But to actually stop at the moon and go into orbit, that free ride isn't enough. You have to fire your engine to slow down. And here's the terrifying part. That slowdown burn had to happen on the far side of the moon, the side facing away from Earth, which means the exact moment when everything had to go perfectly was the exact moment the crew lost all radio contact with home. The moon itself was blocking the signal. So picture mission control in Houston. The crew goes behind the moon. The radios go quiet. The engine is supposed to burn for about 4 minutes back there in the dark to drop them into lunar orbit. Burn too long or at the wrong angle, they crash. Don't burn at all, they whip around and come home, mission failed but alive. And nobody on Earth can do a single thing except wait for the spacecraft to reappear and hopefully start talking again. When Apollo 8's signal came back right on schedule, and Jim Lovell calmly reported that they'd made it safely into lunar orbit, you can imagine the exhale in that room. And the really nervy part is that they had to do the whole thing a second time. To leave lunar orbit and actually start the trip home, the crew had to fire that engine again, and that burn also happened on the far side, out of radio contact. So the last thing anyone on Earth heard from Apollo 8 before the ride back was another long stretch of pure silence. Then, right on schedule, their voices came back. Now fast forward 57 years. Artemis II went through its own version of this exact moment. After leaving Earth, the crew swung out toward the moon and passed only about 4,000 miles above its far side, which is closer than you might think. And just like Apollo 8, there was a stretch of around 40 minutes where the spacecraft slipped behind the moon and out of contact. Same blackout, same room full of people holding their breath, different decade, identical knot in everyone's stomach. Here's the wild part though, the moon hasn't changed at all. It sits in the exact same spot it did in 1968, still big enough to block every radio signal. So going behind it still means going quiet, and coming back out the other side still isn't something anyone gets to take for granted. While they were up there orbiting the moon, the Apollo 8 crew took what might be the most famous photograph ever made. You've definitely seen it. It's called Earthrise. Here's how it happened. They were coming around the moon, staring out at this gray, dead, cratered surface, when suddenly the Earth popped up over the lunar horizon. And on the onboard tape, you can actually hear Bill Anders scrambling for a camera, going, "Oh my God, look at that picture over there! There's the Earth coming up! Wow, is that pretty!" He shot it on color film, and that single frame, which NASA filed under the deeply romantic name AS8-14-2383, changed how people saw our planet. It was the first time humans had ever seen the Earth as this tiny, fragile marble floating in nothing. A lot of people credit that one photo with helping kickstart the modern environmental movement, and then it got even bigger. On Christmas Eve, live from lunar orbit, the 3 astronauts did a TV broadcast. They took turns reading from the Book of Genesis, and Frank Borman signed off with, "Good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good Earth." According to Smithsonian historians, something like 1 billion people were watching or listening, roughly 1 in 4 humans alive at the time. It's still one of the most watched broadcasts in history. You have to remember what kind of year 1968 had been for a lot of the world. Long, exhausting, and full of division. And then, right at the end of it, 3 guys orbiting the moon sent back this message of quiet awe. Afterward, Borman got a telegram from a stranger that simply said, "Congratulations to the crew of Apollo 8. You saved 1968. Okay, so now come back to Artemis II because NASA very clearly did not forget any of this. The team behind the 2026 mission knew exactly how much that Earthrise image meant. So while Orion was out near the moon, the crew deliberately shot the modern sequel, the Earth slipping down behind the moon, which they called Earthset. Same planet, same gut punch of seeing how small it looks against all that black. Filmed this time in crisp, modern, high-definition video instead of on a hand-loaded film camera. It's basically the same photograph, taken by 2 crews who understood they were part of one continuing story. And that idea, the same story continuing, is exactly where these 2 missions quietly went their separate ways. So here's that one big difference, the one that sounds completely backwards until you understand why. Apollo 8, back in 1968, went into orbit around the moon. It circled it 10 times over about 20 hours, close enough to see individual craters and boulders, close enough that the crew was scouting future landing sites with their own eyes. Artemis II in 2026, with all its extra power and technology, did not actually orbit the moon. It flew that free return path, looped around behind the moon, and headed for home. It got close, but it never actually stopped and circled. It basically did a very long, very fast drive-by. Now, if you're keeping score, that seems totally upside down. The 1968 mission, on a barely tested rocket, steered by a computer whose memory was literally woven together by hand out of copper wire, orbited the moon. The 2026 mission, with 57 years of progress behind it, waved at it on the way past. What? But this is the part that makes the whole thing click. Artemis II did less on purpose because the 2 missions were trying to prove completely different things. Apollo 8 was a sprint. The goal was to reach the moon and orbit it before the Soviets could, using whatever it took and accepting some genuinely scary risks to do it. Artemis II was a systems check for something much bigger. It was the very first time humans flew inside the brand new Orion spacecraft, and NASA wanted to test all the stuff that keeps people alive out in deep space. The life support, the displays, the hand controls, the way the heat shield handles the trip home. And they wanted to test it before committing a crew to anything harder. Under NASA's current plan, the next mission, Artemis III, will test docking with the new commercial moonlanders in Earth orbit, and then Artemis IV will put people back on the lunar surface for the first time since 1972. You really don't want to find a problem with your life support system when you're deep into a mission that complex. There was also a very specific reason to be careful about the ride home. The uncrewed test flight before this, Artemis I in 2022, came back fine. But afterward, engineers found that the heat shield had cracked and worn away more than they expected. So for Artemis II, NASA kept that same heat shield, but changed the flight path back through the atmosphere to keep the temperatures more manageable. When you've got people on board, close enough on a heat shield is not a phrase anybody wants to hear. So the flyby wasn't the new mission falling short of the old one. It was a careful, deliberate first step, and it was designed that way on purpose. Okay, let's do the fun part. Let's put these two trips right next to each other and see what 57 years of progress actually buys you. Start with the crews. Apollo 8 flew 3 American military test pilots, which was pretty much the only kind of astronaut there was back then. Artemis II flew a 4-person international crew, 3 astronauts from NASA, plus Jeremy Hansen from the Canadian Space Agency, the first Canadian ever to fly all the way out to the moon. One of the NASA crew, Christina Cook, had already spent 328 days, nearly a full year, in space on a single mission. So in 57 years, we went from a very specific, all-American profile to a bigger, more international team. For a mission that was, on paper, retracing 1968, that crew was doing something genuinely new. The rockets are a fun one too. The old Saturn V was actually the taller of the two, standing about 363 feet, a genuine skyscraper. The new SLS is a bit shorter at around 322 feet, but it hits harder off the pad. NASA says it produces about 8.8 million pounds of thrust at liftoff, roughly 15% more than the Saturn V's 7.5 million. So the newer rocket is shorter and stronger. One more difference worth a mention. Apollo was an almost entirely American effort, top to bottom. Orion isn't. The part of the spacecraft that powers it and pushes it through space, called the service module, was actually built in Europe by the European Space Agency and Airbus. Getting to the moon in 2026 was a team sport spread across several countries. Now the computers, because this is the one that always breaks my brain. Apollo 8 flew with the Apollo Guidance Computer. It ran at about 2 megahertz and had somewhere around 2,000 words of working memory. The entire thing weighed roughly 70 pounds. Orion, meanwhile, runs on flight computers that NASA says are about 20,000 times faster than that Apollo computer, with something like 128,000 times more memory. They're a toughened, radiation-hardened version of the same kind of computer that flies in a Boeing 787. And all that computing power changed the astronauts' actual job. Apollo 8 leaned heavily on its crew to fly and navigate. Jim Lovell took star sightings through a sextant and lined up the guidance system by hand, and the astronauts steered the ship's attitude themselves. Orion, on the other hand, can basically fly itself. An uncrewed one had already flown all the way to the moon and back on Artemis I with nobody on board. So on Artemis II, the crew could have been along for the ride for most of the trip. But that's not what they did. A few hours in, pilot Victor Glover took manual control and flew Orion out to the spent rocket stage and back, a hands-on rehearsal for the kind of docking that future missions will need. No one had ever flown that spacecraft by hand until then. The trips themselves. Apollo 8 lasted about 6 days. Artemis II ran a bit longer, right around 9. Both crews came screaming back into the atmosphere at lunar return speed, roughly 25,000 miles an hour, hitting the air so hard that the outside of the capsule glowed. And none of this is cheap, by the way. NASA's own Inspector General estimates that each of these early Artemis launches costs over $4 billion. And Apollo, for the record, was not exactly a bargain either. But here's my favorite number of the whole thing. On its way around, Artemis II actually set a record. The crew reached about 252,756 miles from Earth, which is the farthest any human beings have ever been from home. It beat the previous record, held by the crew of Apollo 13 all the way back in 1970, by around 4,000 miles. So what do you actually make of 2 trips to the same place, taken 57 years apart? Here's where I land. Apollo 8 was humanity proving for the very first time and under enormous pressure that we could leave our planet, travel to another world, and come back. It was bold, it was rushed, it was genuinely dangerous, and it worked. It was the door getting kicked open. Artemis II was something quieter, but in its own way just as important. It was us walking back through that same door on purpose, carefully, methodically, with the long-term goal of actually staying this time. It did less than Apollo 8 in the narrow sense of not orbiting, but it did it as the deliberate first step of a program built to land people on the moon again and keep them there. And the two missions are literally connected by the people who flew them. While the crew was out there near the moon, Mission Control played them a wake-up message from Jim Lovell, one of the 3 men who made that first terrifying trip on Apollo 8. Lovell had recorded it shortly before he passed away in 2025 at 97 years old. He welcomed the new crew to what he called his old neighborhood, talked about the view of Earth that he and Borman and Anders got back in 1968, and then he said the line that ties this whole story together. "I'm proud to pass that torch on to you." Think about that for a second. The same distance, the same going dark behind the moon, the same held breath, the same ride home through the fire. Done once by 3 people who genuinely weren't sure they'd survive it, and done again by 4 people carrying the whole thing forward. Same journey, 57 years apart, but not the same reason for making it. In 1968, we went to win a race, to prove as fast as we possibly could that human beings could reach another world at all. In 2026, we went back with no need to prove that, taking a slow, careful first step toward a moon we can actually stay on. We got safer and we got smarter. And the moon, patient as ever, was sitting right where we left it.